Chapter 16. Don't look back in anger. After my full medical board, it was apparent that my military career was coming to an end. My only concern was what now? How would I be able to provide for my family? And what would I do next? I had been a soldier for my whole adult life. It was all I knew. In fact, however, I had been a soldier for the majority of my life. This was who I was. It had defined me. I wasn't a Mr. Watson. I was Colour Sergeant Watson, a tough, robust infantry soldier. What skills did I have to offer in the civilian world? I now had 12 months to mentally adjust, to adapt to this new deployment. I still had the mindset of a soldier and would tackle this head on. I would succeed. I wouldn't be defeated. Being at a personal recovery unit had given me perspective, as I was living at home in Manchester for my final 12 months of service. This allowed me to gradually shed the skin of my given institutionalized military identity and evolve into my new civilian one. Normally, if I was in my unit, I would be working until my last day, when my terminal leave kicked in. I'd even witnessed colleagues sign waivers to enable them to deploy on operations throughout their final 12 months, which was against military policy. But the operational demands of my generation were always prioritized, and the soldiers obediently put the Army's needs before their own. I've always had a will-to-win mentality, but on leaving the Army under a medical discharge, this has changed. I was struggling with rejection and abandonment issues, as I felt that I was forced out, discarded, broken, and this was due to my physical injury. Soldiers would like to believe that they are in control of their destiny and their actions, or they wouldn't be able to cope with the operational stresses and life-depending tough decisions whilst on deployment. This will-to-win attitude is essential for operational success. However, I was now feeling doubtful, unsure, and afraid of the future, and this changed my outlook to a more negative, fear of failure mindset. I was no longer looking to the future with optimism and confidence, but with concern and doubt. This was solely due to my injury, as I, and only I, knew the severity of it. I'd been desperately hiding the true nature of my injury for the past 4 years in a desperate attempt to cling on to the identity of the soldier. Now, I had to accept my disappointment, my perceived failure as a soldier, and being forcibly thrown out of the military haven that had defined me as a man. This was taking its toll emotionally, and was engaging with and reminding me of my caged PTSD. Let us not forget that it was my identity as a soldier, my armor, that was enabling me to suppress my dormant emotional trauma. I had anxiety when thinking about the future, and what would happen when I gradually let go of this armor, this identity. As a proven coping mechanism, I decided to throw myself into work, in an attempt to distract myself from my negative thoughts. I would volunteer at organizations such as the Prince's Trust as a mentor for young people. This allowed me to wear my uniform once more, my armor, and was a temporary fix. I would then complete my career transitions workshop at Fulwood Barracks in Preston, and I was very optimistic about this course. Personally, this course was a waste of time for me, as it was basically a CV writing exercise. It did, however, provide links to job fairs and favourable businesses that preferred to employ veterans. Unfortunately, this wasn't suitable for my personal circumstances due to my injury. Besides, I was now waiting on further surgery to have my spine fused, which would add further uncertainty and doubt towards my future employment prospects. Whilst attending this brief course, it soon became apparent that the main focus was on future employment and gaining new skills for life after the military. This was not necessarily a bad thing, but depending on how long you had served, dictated the accessibility and level of support that was available. As a result of serving over 19 years, luckily, I was given the maximum amount of resettlement benefits. This included an intriguing option that the Ministry of Defence would fully subsidise the cost of university fees. I'd always regretted my youth and not fulfilling my potential at school. I didn't have any A-levels and was fascinated at the prospect of attaining a degree. But how? And in what field? The prospect of higher education study excited me. But I was also aware that my inner demons were beginning to surface throughout this transition to civilian life. Maybe by throwing myself into study and keeping my mind active, I thought to myself, I would be able to contain my suppressed emotions from my battlefield experiences. I was pleasantly surprised when I was accepted on a course at the Political History Department at Salford University. This consisted of 2 sister courses, one in contemporary political and international history, and the other being contemporary military and international history. I applied for the latter, and was successful due to the civilian accreditations that I had acquired from my command and leadership courses, but mainly through my lived experience on the subject. This new venture, post-service, provided me with a new purpose, one that would hopefully help keep my bubbling inner demons at bay. Mental health was always taboo in my experience of soldiering, so it came as no surprise that no mental health awareness training was included as part of my resettlement process. Even now, this seems negligent and would explain why so many soldiers suffer with their mental health on the return to civilian life. My generation of soldiers were exposed to brutal behavioral training methods that indoctrinated us, changed our perceptions, and pushed us to our physical and mental limits. We were drones in a hive that were relentlessly deployed on operations around the globe with little rest in between. Our core values deemed us to prioritize the greater good, the British Army's needs above our own, and that is exactly what we did. The infantry's behavioral training methods had finally been perfected, and we were testament to this. Emotionally, we were broken and in pain, and we were all hurting from our experiences, whether some admitted it or not. Our training had allowed us, through controlled aggression, to turn from calm to killer, then back again on command, without hesitation, without thought. How would this destructive mindset adapt after our service ended? Surely there would be some form of de-escalation training to help us understand and cope with the different demands of the civilian world. Sadly not. The priority was exclusively to promote job opportunities, and then, on the final day, we were informed of what charity support was available in civilian life. Charities. Where was the support from the government? Help for Heroes, for example, didn't send me to war, so why were they responsible for my well-being? Where was the support from the Ministry of Defence? The government? After my spinal fusion in February 2015, Jane had noticed a mood change in me. I was having trouble coping with my inner demons. My ongoing struggle with my battlefield experiences was pushing closer to the surface, the nearer I was getting to becoming a civilian. I was still ashamed that I was struggling with my mental health and was determined that I was not going to admit it, that I was fine. This was weakness, after all. However, I was also struggling with my mental health regarding the loss of my military identity, plus accepting my new physical limitations. As a child, I had excelled at sports and martial arts. In the military, I had represented my battalion playing rugby, hockey and skiing, and had competed in athletics. I'd always been proud of my high levels of fitness, and this was part of my character, my personality. It was who I was. I was painfully losing my military identity, but also struggling with the new physical limitations of being disabled, and Jane had started to take notice of this. I remember talking to Jane about this, and she suggested that I seek help. I spoke to her in depth about how I was struggling mentally with not being able to play sports, to run, to even acknowledge that I was now disabled. I had even begun to loathe myself due to the fact that family days out were limited by my mobility and pain needs. However, this was good, as it distracted Jane away from my true pain, my loss of identity, and underlying suppressed emotions. We discussed seeking help from a sports psychiatrist, but I didn't pursue it. I didn't want to. I thought at the time that discussing part of my deteriorating mental health was a sufficient way of managing it. When I was diagnosed with PTSD, I became very open about it, as I believed that it would encourage others to seek help, to break free from the perceived negative military relationship with mental health. This would not necessarily be the case. However, several veterans did open up to me about their own experiences whilst completing this book, which is a good start. Every veteran's journey is unique, but we are all fearful of the cliff edge that is civilian life. I'd always laughed off the claims that we were all indoctrinated and institutionalized, as I had always segregated my personal life from my military one. Some veterans found the career transition workshop beneficial, and it was a useful bridge, allowing us to retrain, network, and find future employment. However, if you are injured and facing ongoing medical rehabilitation on discharge, your options become limited. Each journey is unique with many success stories, but unfortunately for many, this was just a CV writing exercise. Kenny left the Army in December 2012 and refers to the process of the Career Transition Workshop as a complete waste of time. And also, like myself, he thought it was a CV writing exercise. The only thing that had been beneficial from his experience was to set up a LinkedIn account. Kenny had already decided to retrain as a gas engineer and knew what he wanted to do as a civilian. He successfully transitioned into civilian life, but took up immediate employment for a military housing subcontractor. Kenny's new role would be to repair boilers in service quarters, which allowed him to still be associated with military life, and as such, he was still able to retain part of his military identity by working in a familiar military environment. When asked if he received any education prior to discharge regarding his own mental health, he replied with the expected answer of no. However, he did mention that on his final medical before leaving the British Army, which was bizarrely 6 months after he had left, he was offered medical health support. Ironically, this offer was only for a 6-month period and had now expired. Unbeknown to Kenny, or just hidden deep down, like many of my generation, Kenny was suppressing his own inner demons from his vast operational deployments and this would eventually be triggered by a life-changing event to come. Kenny also mentioned that on arrival, all of his paperwork had previously been filled out and that he had an apparent clean bill of health. He immediately and angrily corrected this colonel from the Army Medical Corps, due to the fact that he was no longer that obedient soldier, and insisted that his final medical was corrected to echo the truth. His hearing had deteriorated since his first deployment to Iraq, and he'd also been suffering with a back injury in the later years of his military service. I found this very interesting, and couldn't help but wonder how many veterans had put in failed compensation claims for injuries sustained in service, but who, like Kenny, apparently had a miraculous clean bill of health. How many of these claims were delayed or denied due to poor or complacent military administration? And what was the harmful impact on the mental health of these veterans post-service? When discussing mental health, Kenny then courageously spoke about his own battles, how he now struggles with his own mental health due to trauma from his lived experiences as a soldier. He painfully explained that after a recent heart attack, emotionally, he has not been the same since. How, in the days afterwards, he would just burst into tears for no apparent reason whatsoever. Even now, certain triggers from TV cause him to emotionally break down. Kenny is not alone, as many of my brethren have spoken about similar such experiences. But unfortunately, like Kenny, they refused to seek professional help, and this was due to the way that they were trained. My generation of soldiers would rather struggle with poor mental health than openly admit to themselves that they are suffering with PTSD. This stems from our training and the association of emotions being weakness. Kenny, like many veterans, may have lost his uniform and military identity, but this detrimental mindset remained. With no mental health management or awareness training being offered post-service, this comes as no surprise. Kenny then spoke of his vast experiences throughout his 25 years' service, initially as an infantryman, and then as an armourer. He had worked with many different regiments and units, but there was an obvious pattern regarding mental health. From Kenny's experiences, the command element was not interested in dealing with the issue of mental health. This was not necessarily related to PTSD from operations, but all types of mental health, including depression and trauma. Kenny had experience of soldiers suffering with poor mental health being segregated from their units, sent on sick leave for 12 to 18 months, or never to be seen or heard from again. They were quarantined, treated like they had an infectious disease that may spread to the other soldiers. I can only imagine how harmful this process would have been for those unfortunate soldiers, as their brethren would have undoubtedly supported them, but were never given the opportunity to do so. Due to the fact that I was recovering from spinal surgery, I wasn't physically able enough to use the career transition workshop to gain a new practical skill or qualification. Instead, I opted to attend university and make amends for my childhood mistakes. I left the Army in the August and started university in the September, studying contemporary military and international history. Looking back, this course and intense study that is required for a history degree helped me in keeping my suppressed trauma hidden for a short time at least. I was completely focused on my studies, and similar to what I had done to cope during my military career, I buried myself in all aspects of my studies, and this allowed me to distract my subconscious and my inner demons and keep them at bay. It was at university where I would become good friends with Chris. On our induction, I had instantly noticed that Chris was also a veteran, as he was carrying a Help for Heroes backpack, the type that only injured veterans are given. We would later laugh and joke about how nervous we both were at starting university, despite both serving in Iraq and Afghanistan. Chris was very open about his ongoing struggle with PTSD, and this was made obvious by his anxious demeanour. Despite not serving together, from different regiments, and the fact that he was an officer, we formed a close bond, the bond that only veterans have, built on a foundation of dark humour and childish jokes. Chris would frequently self-medicate with alcohol as a primary coping mechanism when battling his own inner demons. In the final days of his life, he would also turn to illicit drugs in a deadly attempt to help him forget about his own experiences of warfare. Chris, like the majority of my generation who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, was struggling daily with survivor's guilt. He had witnessed far too many of our friends and comrades being severely injured or fatally wounded. He had seen ethnic cleansing firsthand, and unspeakable atrocities to civilians, and our inner demons provided us with a daily reminder of this. Like many commanders from my generation, Chris would continuously reenact his operational decisions and battlefield experiences in his mind, but through the unproductive channel of hindsight. We shared some very philosophical conversations about the very nature of warfare, and the naive, romantic, ideological notion that first attracted us to the armed forces compared to the cruel, bitter reality that we both had endured. We'd both been commanders and had shared similar battlefield experiences, and through this, our friendship was forged. I had not been diagnosed with PTSD at the time, but by sharing his own trauma, Chris was helping me realize that I too needed help, and for this realization, I will always be grateful. Personally, I'd always asked myself the following questions when analyzing my own survivor's guilt. Could I have done more? Did I make the right decision? Are these deaths my fault? Am I a murderer? Am I to blame? We both shared similar burdens, and Chris once asked me if he had been at fault. Did he make the right decisions? I'd always had the outlook that you can never fairly judge another low-level commander's tactical decisions in battle, as we often had to make impossible decisions on the spot. Besides, we were encouraged from our leadership training to impose our own traits and experiences onto our planning, which made us all unique and difficult to predict. Fortunately, though, I had been asked a similar question by a younger commander after the war in Iraq in 2003, and I provided Chris with a comparable reply. You can plan and train as much as you like, but regrettably, you have no control over what the enemy are doing. It is inevitable that soldiers will get injured, soldiers will die, and that is why the best laid plans go to shit when the bullets and bombs start flying. The enemy, especially in counterinsurgency warfare, are sneaky bastards, and quickly evolve tactically. All you can do is react to the situation, and that's all that matters. There are no right or wrong decisions. It's greyer and more complex. It's just warfare. As a commander, you have to accept that all soldiers, including your men, are expendable. Personally, like Chris, my sole responsibility was always to my men, and this is why he significantly struggled with his own mental health. He was blown out of his vehicle and unable to command his men, and blamed himself for the actions of the enemy and his lack of anticipation of their intent on the battlefield. Chris was not at fault. The enemy were. But regardless of how many drunken conversations we had on the subject, it was Chris's inner guilt, which had manifested into PTSD, that would ultimately result in his tragic and untimely death. I was aware that Chris's self-medication with alcohol was a problem, and this wasn't for me to judge. His deteriorating mental health, continual suicide attempts, and subsequent hospital admissions, alongside his inconsistent mental health care, had led to his discharge. I always thought that if he was going to get wasted, then at least, if I was with him, I could keep an eye on him. Chris was financially okay, but like me, wanted the Ministry of Defence, the government, to acknowledge the depths of his injury and the devastating impact that it had had on his career, his wife, his family, his perceived identity, his whole life. He was a shadow of his former self, and would question the severity of his PTSD due to the Armed Forces compensation scheme denying him the compensation level that warranted his trauma. He desperately sought the validation that the Army believed him, that they would acknowledge how severe his mental health had become. That validation could only come from the compensation, as it had not come from anywhere else. He was a soldier, after all, and we are trained to follow orders, to be obedient, and these bureaucrats exploited this. Chris's battle with his mental health, self-medicating, and inconsistent mental health care would eventually take its toll, and he would die of the physical effects of an enlarged heart, aged just 35. Another victim of war. He had previously told me that after several attempts to take his own life, he now was in control of his mental health, and that he was going to look after his body. I genuinely believed him when he went into the details about how he had regretted his last suicide attempt. After the paramedics revived him, he told me that his latest brush with death had given him a real will to live, and I was proud of him. This was the last time I spoke to Chris. 2 months later, he died. Another preventable victim as a consequence of the lack of post-service mental health support for our veterans. Chris's was, in my opinion, an unintentional suicide due to his deteriorating mental health. He had symptoms and was treated for atrial fibrillation. But this was never explored fully by medical professionals, and he wasn't able to prioritize his physical health due to his PTSD, his nightmares, his internal demons. At the request of his family, Chris would have a full military funeral. At his service, I could not help but think, where was the support from his regiment when he needed it? Where was this church full of uniformed soldiers in their best regalia when Chris needed them? Where was the support from the government that had sent him to war? At the wake, in a drunken, emotional state, I flung my medals across the dance floor, as I had become annoyed with strangers praising me for my service, my sacrifices on the basis that I had a chest full of accolades. My medals had always meant more to other people than myself, and I had always believed that the medals don't necessarily make the man. Rather, the man makes the medals. These were a reminder of my sacrifices, my own struggles, and a system that was failing its veterans. Also, with my own inner demons becoming increasingly more difficult to suppress, I was struggling to process Chris's preventable death. A female major eventually found my medals and attempted to give them to me, and I remember being very disrespectful and, quite frankly, a dick in return. I didn't want them, as these were just a reminder of my guilt and the internal battles that I was having within my own mind. Thankfully, she distracted me long enough with several Jaeger bombs and slipped them into my jacket pocket. When I mentioned this to Niall, he was appalled. Niall has a completely different outlook regarding our medals. I perceived these material items as nothing more than an unwanted reminder of the horrors of war, whereas Niall had a more philosophical outlook. Niall was proud of his medals, his service, and the sacrifices of our brethren, particularly those who made the ultimate sacrifice and didn't come home. Niall proudly wears his medals to honour the fallen, our brothers who gave their all. I respect his views regarding our medals, but as a result of how our veterans are disregarded by the government, our opinions still continue to differ. After the funeral, Chris's father described his son's death as unnecessary and claimed that Britain's armed forces had discarded their responsibilities by failing to properly help their veterans. This was 2017, and not much has changed since. Chris's first suicide attempt was in December 2011, whilst he was still serving, and the Army's mental health support was lacking and ultimately swept it under the carpet. After his mental health deteriorated to another crisis point, he was passed from one mental health practitioner to the next, totaling 13 in one single year. This lack of continuity regarding his mental health care while he was still a serving member of the British Army only further exacerbated his intense battlefield trauma. After his medical discharge, Chris was cast into the NHS system that was ill-equipped to deal with the complexity of his PTSD. Even charities such as Combat Stress could not provide a program of support to treat him or help him due to a lack of resources. I unequivocally believe that it was the lack of adequate government aftercare that failed Chris, and I cannot help but feel that I also failed him as a friend, as a brother. Not even the trauma of Chris's death would make me acknowledge that I was also suffering with PTSD. If this ordeal wouldn't make me seek help, then what would? Whilst I was a serving soldier, the death of former colleagues, my brothers, became an increasingly normal occurrence and was accepted, but ignored. I can recall numerous accounts of Guardsmen from my former regiment taking their own lives, and, as tragic as this was, we subconsciously chose to ignore this. Whilst serving, you were in a bubble, a false economy, and this creates a world within a world, even more so in a regiment or battalion. When you are part of this, you inevitably become engrossed in what is referred to as battalion life. I must point out that we were institutionalized and believed that this routine, this subculture, kept us safe. But once soldiers left the battalion, they quickly became an afterthought. As a result of this mentality, you can easily shut yourself off and segregate yourself from the outside world. I personally did this, and this helped me to ignore the struggles and dangers that the veterans community were facing. No serving soldier would honestly like to admit to themselves that there is no sufficient aftercare on discharge. Why would they? How could they justify their sacrifices and unwavering loyalty towards the British Army's needs if this loyalty wasn't reciprocated in return? The preventable death of my friend Chris had shaken my confidence to its very limits, and more so my loyalty to my country. I had chosen to ignore the ongoing pandemic of veteran suicides, as I was struggling to contain my own inner demons. I was fearful that if I let the genie out of the bottle and faced the 2 decades of suppressed emotions, that I too could become another statistic, another veteran suicide. I loved my family. They were my only priority. So rather than seeking help, my unhealthy and irrational logic concluded that it was better to try and keep my own battlefield trauma unproductively suppressed. I subconsciously knew that I was a ticking time bomb and kept telling myself that I wasn't weak. But I was conflicted, as I felt like I was about to explode.